He pointed at her like she was something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "Get out," he said, "and take your trash with you." She was holding a mop. Her hands were still wet. There was a streak of cleaning solution drying on her left cheek, and she hadn't eaten since morning because the kitchen staff wasn't allowed to eat until the family had finished their meals. She didn't cry, she didn't argue, she simply set the mop against the wall, removed her apron, folded it neatly on the counter, and walked out. Everyone in that room watched her go. Nobody stopped her. And not one person in that house, not the mother, not the guests, not the man who had pointed his finger at her, had any idea that they had just made the single most catastrophic mistake of their lives, but they would find out. And when they did, it wouldn't be in private, it wouldn't be quiet. It would happen in front of every person whose opinion they had spent their entire lives trying to manage. This is that story. Her name was Elena Reyes. She was 29 years old. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a low bun when she worked, which was every day. She had steady hands and careful eyes and a habit of noticing things that other people walked past without seeing. She noticed when the flower arrangement in the foyer had gone 3 days without fresh water. She noticed when the marble floors near the east corridor needed a second pass because the morning light hit them differently than the afternoon light. She noticed when the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Patel, was having a hard day with her knees, and she quietly took over Mrs. Patel's section without being asked. She had been working at the Whitfield estate for 4 months. In those 4 months, she had learned the layout of the house better than most people who had lived in it for years. She had learned that Mr. Whitfield Sr. liked his study kept at 68 degrees, and that his son, Marcus Whitfield, preferred it at 72, which meant there was always a quiet battle of adjustments happening between the 2 floors. She had learned that the second staircase near the back kitchen was faster than the main one. She had learned that the one thing no member of the Whitfield family could tolerate was being made to wait. But there was one thing Elena had not told anyone, not the other staff, not the estate manager, not a single person inside those walls. She had not told them who she was. Not because she was hiding, because she was watching. And what she saw during those 4 months told her everything she needed to know about the kind of people who lived behind that beautiful front door. But we'll get to that. First, the morning it all broke open. It was a Saturday in late October. The Whitfield estate was preparing for a luncheon. 12 guests, all of them from what Marcus Whitfield called the right circles, which was a phrase he used often and without irony. The dining room had been set since 8 in the morning. The caterers had arrived at 9. By 10, the house smelled like fresh lilies and warm bread, and the particular kind of nervous energy that comes when wealthy people try to appear effortless. Elena had been working since 6. She had polished the entryway floors. She had helped arrange the table settings according to the seating chart Marcus's assistant had sent over on Thursday. She had pressed the linen napkins herself because the caterer's napkins had arrived with a crease in the wrong direction, and she knew without being told that this was the kind of detail that Marcus Whitfield would notice and comment on in front of everyone. At 10:45, one of the guests arrived early. A woman in a silk blouse and oversized sunglasses who immediately took issue with the temperature in the sitting room. Eleanor adjusted the thermostat. The woman then decided the floral arrangement on the side table was too tall and blocked her view of the garden. Elena moved it, without a word. At 11, Marcus came downstairs. He was wearing a navy blazer, and the expression of a man who had already decided the day was going to be difficult. He walked through the sitting room, barely glancing at the guest, and went straight to the kitchen to find the estate manager, a quiet man named Harris. Elena was in the kitchen preparing the garnish trays the caterers had forgotten to finish. Marcus looked at her. Then he looked at the trays. Then he looked back at her. "What are you doing?" he asked. The garnish presentation wasn't finished, Elena said. I was completing it. Marcus picked up one of the trays, inspected it for exactly 2 seconds, and set it back down. These are wrong, he said. The caterers brought the wrong garnishes. I specifically said cucumber rounds, not slices. Rounds. Elena looked at the tray. The difference was minimal. She did not say this. I can ask the caterers if they have. I don't want you to ask, Marcus said. I want it handled, quietly, without me having to explain basic instructions twice. He turned to Harris. Is this the kind of work we're accepting now? Harris said nothing. He had learned, over many years, that the safest answer to questions like that was silence. Marcus turned back to Elena. Something had shifted in his face. Not quite anger. Something closer to contempt. You, he said. What's your name? Eleanor? Eleanor. He repeated it like it tasted bad. How long have you been here? 4 months. 4 months, he echoed. He looked around the kitchen slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. And in 4 months, you haven't learned that this house has standards? Elena met his eyes. I understand the house has standards. Do you? His voice went flat. Because what I'm seeing right now doesn't reflect that. And then the guests began to arrive. They came through the front door in pairs and small clusters, voices rising as they greeted each other, the sitting room filling with the specific sound of people who are comfortable taking up space. Marcus excused himself from the kitchen and went to welcome them. Elena continued working. 10 minutes later, Marcus was back. This time, he had a guest with him, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the polished ease of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. The man had apparently expressed interest in seeing the full estate, which was something Marcus loved to show off. They came through the kitchen, and the man with silver hair, whose name Elena would later learn was Robert Calloway, a venture capitalist from London who had built 3 companies from nothing and sold 2 of them for numbers that required a comma to write, stopped when he saw Eleanor. He stopped, completely. His expression did something complicated, and then, before he could speak, Marcus put his hand on Calloway's arm and steered him toward the hallway. The real showpiece is the East Garden, Marcus was saying. We had it re-landscaped last spring. In a moment, Calloway said. He turned back to Elena. His voice, when he spoke, was careful, like a man choosing his words with great precision. Excuse me, he said. I apologize for staring. You remind me of someone. Elena smiled politely. It happens. Calloway studied her for one more moment, that expression still doing something she couldn't quite read, and then allowed Marcus to guide him toward the garden. But before he disappeared through the door, he looked back at her one more time, and in his eyes there was something that looked almost like recognition. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Lunch was served at 1 o'clock. Elena worked through the meal, refilling water, coordinating with the caterers, making sure the kitchen stayed organized during the controlled chaos of serving 12 people simultaneously. She was good at this. She moved through crowded spaces without bumping into people. She read a room the way some people read a page, quickly, completely, without having to go back. The luncheon went well by all visible measures. The garnish issue had been resolved. The cucumber rounds had been sourced from a nearby market by one of the junior staff. The temperature in the dining room held steady. The lilies looked magnificent in the afternoon light. Marcus was in a good mood, which was, Eleanor had learned, the most dangerous version of Marcus Whitfield, because when Marcus was in a good mood, he became performative. He became louder. He began to treat the people around him as props in a show he was staging for the benefit of his guests. At 2:15, when the luncheon was winding down and people had moved to the sitting room for coffee and dessert, Marcus called for Eleanor. She came from the kitchen, still in her uniform, still carrying the quiet efficiency she brought to every task. "Eleanor," Marcus said, and his voice carried across the room, in a way that made several guests turn to look. "I wanted to address something from this morning." Elena stood still. She had a feeling, the way you sometimes do, that the next 60 seconds were going to matter in a way she couldn't yet fully see. "The garnish situation," Marcus said with a lightness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The cucumber rounds." He looked at his guests with the expression of a man sharing a relatable anecdote. "I had to explain 3 times this morning that there is a difference between cucumber slices and cucumber rounds to a member of my household staff." He shook his head. "I sometimes wonder what we're paying for." Laughter, mild and polite, moved through the room. Elena said nothing. Marcus continued. "I've been patient. I've given 4 months of chances." His voice shifted, dropped just slightly. "But I run this house to a certain standard. And the people who work here need to be able to meet that standard, or they need to find somewhere else to work." He paused, and then he said it. "Frankly, some people just aren't built for this kind of work. And some people," he looked directly at Eleanor, "are just taking up space that someone more capable could be using." The room went quiet. Elena looked at him. She looked at the guests. She looked at Robert Calloway, who was sitting in the chair nearest the window, his coffee cup held very still in his hand, watching Marcus with an expression that had gone carefully, deliberately neutral. And then she looked back at Marcus. "You'd like me to leave?" she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus waved his hand, a dismissal, a gesture so casual it was its own insult. "Clean out whatever you have here. Harris will process your final check." Elena nodded once. She turned and walked back to the kitchen. She collected the small bag she kept under the staff table. A battered leather satchel that none of the Whitfields had ever looked at twice because it looked exactly like the kind of bag a maid would carry. She put on her coat. She said goodbye to Mrs. Patel, who pressed her hand tightly and said nothing because there was nothing safe to say. And she walked out of the Whitfield estate for the last time. She did not look back at the house. She did not look back at Marcus, who had returned to his guests, who was already making another joke, who had already moved on. She walked to her car, sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, and then she made a phone call. The person on the other end answered on the first ring. "It's time," Eleanor said. A pause. "Are you sure?" She looked at the Whitfield estate in her rear-view mirror, the beautiful front door, the perfectly trimmed hedges, the east garden where Marcus liked to impress people. "Yes," she said. "Tell the board." "Now. Before we go any further, you need to understand something about Elena Reyes, because the story you're about to hear is not really about a maid. It never was. Elena Reyes was the daughter of Miguel Reyes, who had founded Reyes Capital Partners 41 years ago with a single office, 2 employees, and a clarity of vision that people in the industry still talk about in the kind of reverent tone usually reserved for something that cannot be replicated. Reyes Capital was not a household name because Miguel had never wanted it to be. He believed that the most powerful institutions were the ones that didn't announce themselves. He had built an empire across private equity, real estate, and early-stage technology investment that spanned 4 countries and touched industries most people interacted with daily without knowing it. When Miguel died, quietly, at home, with Elena beside him, he left everything to his only child, not because she was his daughter, but because she had earned it. Elena had spent 6 years working in every division of her father's company, not in a ceremonial way, not in the way that wealthy children are sometimes given titles that come with no real responsibility. She had worked in acquisitions, in risk assessment, in the operational restructuring unit that went into struggling companies and figured out why they were failing and what it would take to fix them. She had a talent for assessment, for seeing past the surface of things to the structure underneath, for understanding quickly and precisely what something was really worth. When her father died and left her the company, she did something that no one expected. She took 6 months off, not to grieve, although she did grieve, deeply, privately, in the way of people who feel things at full volume but express them at low decibel. She took 6 months off because she wanted to understand something. She had spent her entire life being the daughter of Miguel Reyes. Every room she walked into, every hand she shook, every meeting she attended, people knew who she was before she spoke. And knowing who she was changed the way they treated her, changed what they said, changed what they showed her. She wanted to know what the world looked like when nobody knew her name. So she designed an experiment. She identified 3 businesses that Reyes Capital was considering acquiring, businesses run by people who presented themselves publicly as visionaries, as leaders, as exactly the kind of partners a company like hers would want. And she went to work for them, not in any official capacity, not under her real name, under a simple, clean alias and a carefully constructed employment history that would hold up to casual scrutiny, but not to deep investigation. Because she didn't need it to last forever, she just needed it to last long enough. She wanted to see how these people treated the people who had no power, because she had learned from her father that this was the only reliable measure of character. Not how someone behaved in a negotiation, not how they spoke at a conference, but how they spoke to the person cleaning their floor. The first 2 businesses she had already assessed and moved on. The Whitfield estate, more precisely, Whitfield Development Group, the real estate company that Marcus Whitfield ran and was actively seeking capital investment for, was the third. She had spent 4 months there. She had seen everything she needed to see. And now, as she drove away from the estate for the last time, she pulled out her actual phone, the one she kept in the inner pocket of that battered satchel, the one with a different number and a different set of contacts, and she began to make calls. Marcus Whitfield found out on a Tuesday, not because Elena told him. She had no interest in telling him anything. He found out because Robert Calloway called him. Robert Calloway, who had been at the luncheon. Robert Calloway, who had looked at Elena in the kitchen with that complicated expression. Robert Calloway, who had spent the rest of the luncheon quieter than usual, which Marcus had attributed to tiredness from the flight from London, but which was actually something else entirely. It was a Tuesday morning, and Marcus was in his office at Whitfield Development Group, reviewing the presentation his team had prepared for the capital raise meeting scheduled for the following week. Reyes Capital, a firm that had expressed preliminary interest in Whitfield's latest residential development project, was supposed to be in that meeting. His CFO had told him that getting Reyes on board would be, as she put it, transformational. That Reyes Capital's involvement would open doors they had been trying to open for a decade. Marcus's phone rang. He answered it. "Marcus," Calloway's voice, clipped and professional, not the warm social tone from Saturday. "I'm calling to let you know I'll be withdrawing my participation in the Whitfield project." Marcus went very still. "Robert, what? Why? Is there a—" "I had a conversation last night," Calloway said, "with someone I've known for several years, someone whose judgment I trust considerably." "Who?" Marcus said, and even as he said it, something cold moved through him. "Elena Reyes," Calloway said. "Miguel Reyes's daughter. She runs Reyes Capital now." Silence. Marcus heard his own breathing. "I should tell you," Calloway continued, his voice measured, "that I recognized her at your luncheon on Saturday. I've met her twice before, at industry events, but I wasn't certain until I saw how you spoke to her." A pause. "In front of your guests." Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "I've been in this industry for 30 years, Calloway said, "and I've learned that the clearest signal of how a man runs his business is how he treats people he believes cannot affect him. I'm no longer comfortable recommending this investment." Another pause. "I imagine Reyes Capital won't be attending next week's meeting either. I'd suggest you prepare for that." The line went quiet. Marcus sat at his desk for a long time after the call ended. He was thinking about the kitchen, the mop, the apron folded on the counter. The way Elena had walked out, without a word. He was thinking about what he had said. In front of 12 people, into a room that included Robert Calloway, who had recognized her, who had sat with that carefully neutral expression, who had watched him perform his small cruelty, and said nothing because there was nothing to say, because the thing had already been done. The reveal was already coming. Calloway had just been watching it unfold. He was thinking about the word he had used, trash. He hadn't said it directly. He had been careful, as he always was. He had dressed it in language about standards and capability and taking up space. But the meaning had been clear, and Elena had heard it, and Calloway had heard it. And now Calloway was gone, and the investment he had spent 8 months cultivating was gone with him. He picked up his phone. He called Harris. "The woman who left Saturday," Marcus said. "Eleanor, do you have a contact number for her?" Harris's voice was careful. "She left a number when she was hired, but sir, call it." "Sir?" Harris said slowly. "I don't think—" "Call the number, Harris." A long pause. "The number has been disconnected," Harris said. "She left a secondary email on the employment form. But I should tell you," he paused again, "the name on the employment form doesn't match any background records we can find. I've been looking since Saturday night." Marcus's voice dropped. "Since Saturday night? You knew something was wrong since Saturday?" "I suspected," Harris said, "after Mr. Calloway pulled me aside before he left and asked me a few questions." Marcus set the phone down slowly. He sat with the silence for a moment. Then he opened his laptop and typed 2 words into the search engine. "Elena Reyes." The results loaded. He scrolled through them once, slowly, and then stopped at a photograph. It was from a financial industry conference in Geneva 2 years ago, a panel discussion on sustainable development investment. 5 people seated at a long table with microphones and water glasses and the composed expressions of people who spend their lives being photographed. Elena was third from the left. She was wearing a dark blazer and small pearl earrings. Her hair was down. She looked exactly like herself, composed, precise, watching the room with those careful eyes. The caption read, "Elena Reyes, Chief Executive Officer, Reyes Capital Partners, daughter of the late Miguel Reyes." Marcus stared at the photograph for a long time. He thought about what he had said. He thought about who he had said it to. And then, quietly, in the privacy of his office, with no guests to perform for, and no staff to dismiss, and no one to watch him manage his face, Marcus Whitfield understood, completely and irrevocably, what he had done. But the story doesn't end there, because Elena wasn't finished. The following week, the capital raise meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9. The Whitfield team had spent days preparing. The CFO had redesigned the presentation. The legal team had updated the term sheets. Marcus had personally rehearsed his opening remarks 4 times. At 8:55, the conference room was full. At 9, the receptionist came in and quietly informed Marcus that the representatives from Reyes Capital had arrived. Marcus straightened his jacket. He had spent the entire week trying to contact Elena through every channel he could find. His calls went unanswered. His emails received no response. His attempts to reach the Reyes Capital offices had resulted in polite, precise messages from assistants who told him that Ms. Reyes would be in touch when she was available. He had prepared a speech, something between an apology and an explanation, something that acknowledged the luncheon without dwelling on it, that moved past the incident toward the opportunity, that framed the future as more important than the past. He was ready. The conference room door opened. Elena walked in. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and dark trousers and the same small pearl earrings from the Geneva photograph. Her hair was down. She carried a slim leather portfolio and walked with a measured ease that Marcus now recognized as something he had catastrophically misread. When she was carrying a mop. Behind her came two men in suits, one of whom Marcus recognized as a senior partner at Reyes Capital, and one of whom he did not recognize at all, but who radiated the specific quiet authority of someone who rarely needed to raise his voice. Elena looked at Marcus. He looked at her. She set her portfolio on the table and sat down, not across from him, at the head of the table. She sat at the head of the table without being invited to, without asking, without any visible hesitation, with the complete naturalness of someone who sits at the head of tables often and has never needed permission for it. Marcus cleared his throat. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "I want to start by—" "Let's begin with the project overview," Elena said. Her voice was the same, exactly the same as it had been in the kitchen, steady even, giving nothing away. "We have a full agenda." One of her colleagues opened a laptop. Numbers appeared on the screen at the far end of the room. Marcus paused, recalibrated. "Of course," he said. The meeting ran for 90 minutes. Elena asked precise questions. She had clearly reviewed Whitfield's financials in detail. Not the polished version prepared for investors, but the actual figures which her team had sourced through the kind of thorough due diligence that leaves no comfortable ambiguity intact. She asked about the cost overruns on the third quarter project. She asked about the contractor dispute that had delayed the East Wing development by 4 months. She asked about the legal settlement from 18 months ago that Marcus's team had buried in a footnote. She asked every question that Marcus would have preferred not to answer. And she asked them without emotion, without performance, without any indication that she was anything other than a professional assessing an investment opportunity, which was, of course, exactly what she was. At the end of 90 minutes, she closed her portfolio. "We'll be in touch," she said. She stood. Her colleagues began packing up. Marcus said, "Ms. Reyes?" His voice was quieter than he intended. "Can we—" She paused, looked at him. "I want to apologize," he said. "For Saturday." The room went quiet. Elena studied him for a moment. The two men from her team had gone still. "For which part?" she asked. Marcus opened his mouth. "For the way you spoke to me in the kitchen," she continued, her voice unchanged. "Or for the performance in the sitting room, as in front of your guests?" He couldn't answer. There wasn't an answer that covered it. "I want you to know," Elena said, "that my assessment of Whitfield Development Group is not personal. I'm looking at a business. I'm looking at the numbers, the structure, the leadership, the culture." She paused. "All of those things." Marcus understood what she meant. "Leadership and culture are not separate from a business," Elena said. "They are the business. The way a company treats the people who have the least power is not a footnote. It is the architecture." She picked up her portfolio. "We'll be in touch." She walked out. Her colleagues followed. The conference room was very quiet. Marcus sat at the table where he had prepared to reclaim his position, to move past the incident, to redirect toward the future, and looked at the empty chair at the head of it. The chair where he should have been sitting. The chair where she had sat instead. 3 weeks later, Reyes Capital sent a letter. It was 2 pages, professional, precise, thorough. It outlined the findings of their assessment of Whitfield Development Group. It acknowledged the strengths of the portfolio and the market potential of the proposed development. And then it outlined the concerns, the cost management, the contractor issues, the legal history. And in a final section that Marcus read 3 times, it addressed what the letter called governance and cultural factors. It cited specific incidents. It cited observations from the assessment period. It did not use the word trash. It didn't need to. It concluded that Reyes Capital would not be proceeding with investment at this time, and that they would be sharing their assessment with 2 other institutional investors who had been considering Whitfield as a co-investment opportunity. Marcus put the letter down. He called his CFO. She had already received calls from both of the other investors. They were out. Now this is the part where some people expect a dramatic confrontation, a final scene. Marcus begging Elena for mercy, Elena delivering a speech, the villain on his knees, the whole architecture of the story clicking into its final, satisfying position. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, and more lasting. Elena did not pursue Marcus Whitfield. She did not campaign against him or publicize the story or use her position to orchestrate any kind of dramatic downfall. She assessed the business, found it lacking, declined to invest, and shared her assessment factually, professionally, with other parties who had asked for her opinion. What happened to Marcus was not punishment, it was consequence. When Reyes Capital declined and shared their assessment, the other investors pulled back. Without that capital, the proposed development stalled. Without the development, the projected revenue that Marcus had been using to service existing debt didn't materialize on the timeline he had promised his lenders. By January, Whitfield Development Group had entered restructuring conversations. By March, Marcus had stepped back from his CEO role to allow for fresh leadership during a challenging period. According to the press release that nobody found particularly convincing, the estate was quietly put on the market in the spring. But here is what I want you to understand. Because this story is not really about revenge. It was never about revenge. On the day that Marcus pointed at Elena and told her she was trash, she had been sitting on an assessment that could have ended his company immediately. She had the information, she had the relationships, she had the standing to make a single call that would have unraveled everything he was building. She didn't make that call. She drove away from the estate. She sat in her car. She called her team and said it was time. And then she waited 3 weeks to let the process work the way it was supposed to work, through due diligence, through honest assessment, through the slow, unglamorous machinery of truth, which has no interest in anyone's feelings and no patience for performance. She let the truth do what truth does when it's given room to move. There's a photograph on the wall of the Reyes Capital boardroom. It was taken at a groundbreaking ceremony for a community development project that the Reyes Foundation funded in the fall of the year after all of this happened. A mixed-income housing complex in a neighborhood that had been lobbying for development investment for over a decade. 200 units, community spaces, a small medical clinic on the ground floor. In the photograph, Elena is standing with the construction team and the neighborhood association representatives and the city council member who had spent 4 years trying to get this project funded. She is wearing jeans and work boots. She is holding a hard hat. She is laughing at something someone said. She looks exactly like herself. And if you look at the wall behind her in the photograph, at the concrete foundation of the building beginning to rise from the ground, there is a small plaque already installed. A dedication. It reads, in plain letters, without ceremony, "This building is for the people who were told they were taking up space." Robert Calloway saw the photograph. He had it framed. He sent Elena a note when he did. She wrote back 2 sentences. "Thank you for seeing me, and thank you for letting the process work." There's one more thing. Mrs. Patel, the elderly housekeeper who had pressed Elena's hand on the way out, who had said nothing because there was nothing safe to say, had been at the Whitfield estate for 11 years. She retired 6 months after Marcus stepped down from the company when the estate went on the market and the household staff was let go. Elena heard about it through Harris, who had quietly kept her updated. She called Mrs. Patel. She offered her a position. Not as cleaning staff, but as a community coordinator for the Reyes Foundation's new housing project, a role that involved helping residents navigate the resources available to them in the building, a role that suited exactly the kind of careful, attentive, perceptive person who notices when the flower arrangement needs water and when a colleague needs help and when the right thing to do is press someone's hand and say nothing. Mrs. Patel accepted. She started the following Monday. Marcus Whitfield was at a dinner party in November, a small gathering, mutual friends, the kind of casual social evening that happens when people have too much in common to stop seeing each other, even when they probably should. Someone mentioned Reyes Capital. Someone mentioned the new housing project. Someone mentioned Elena's name. And Marcus, who had been quiet all evening, looked down at his plate. The host, a woman who had been at the October luncheon, who had been in the sitting room when Marcus made his remarks, looked at him. "I remember that day," she said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was not gentle either. When she walked out, Marcus didn't answer. "She folded the apron," the host said. "Did you notice that? She folded it and put it on the counter, in the middle of everything." Marcus had noticed. He had thought at the time that it was a strange thing to do, an irrelevant detail. He understood it now. The apron folded neatly on the counter was not a gesture of defeat. It was a gesture of completion, of someone who finishes what they start, who leaves things in order, who maintains their standards regardless of whether anyone is watching, or whether anyone will notice, or whether the room they are leaving deserves it. It was the gesture of someone who knows exactly who they are. And that, more than anything else, more than the investment pullback, more than the company restructuring, more than the photograph on the boardroom wall, was the thing Marcus Whitfield would carry with him for a very long time. Not the consequence, the clarity. The world is full of people who measure the worth of the person in front of them by what that person appears to have, by the uniform they wear, by the bag they carry, by the work they are paid to do in a given hour of a given day. And the world is also full of people like Elena Reyes. People who have learned from watching this happen that the most important question you can ask about another human being is not what they have, it's how they are when no one powerful is watching. It's whether they fold the apron before they go. Because the truth about power is this: it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't need to, it simply does the work day after day, with steady hands and careful eyes and the patience of someone who knows that the right moment will come. And when it does, it doesn't shout. It just sits down at the head of the table and begins. If this story reached something real in you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or spoken to like you were invisible, drop your city in the comments right now. I read every single one. And tell me, what was the moment you realized your silence was actually your strength? If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, because the people who need these stories most are the ones who almost didn't click. I'll see you in the next one.